U.S.-American engineers were unable to start the M1 Abrams until the general called in an old veteran. A 70-ton tank sits dead in a military hangar, defeated by 3 days of computer diagnostics and 8 frustrated engineers with fancy degrees. Then an old man walks in with a canvas bag full of beat-up tools that look like they belong in a scrapyard, not a high-tech facility. Before we start the story, write in the comments from which part of the world you're watching today. The harsh fluorescent lights of Hangar 12 cast sharp shadows across 70 tons of silent steel as Lieutenant James Miller stared at the diagnostic computer screen for what felt like the 1,000th time in 3 days. The numbers remained unchanged, the error codes continued their meaningless cycle, and the massive tank behind him sat as unresponsive as it had been since this nightmare of a maintenance crisis had begun. Miller was 26 years old, a recent engineering graduate from West Point, who had spent 4 years studying advanced mechanical systems, computer-aided diagnostics, and modern military maintenance protocols. His academic record had been exemplary, his technical certifications were current, and his confidence in systematic problem-solving had never been seriously challenged until this 70-ton beast had defeated every analytical approach he could devise. The tank itself, an Abrams model designated for deployment to overseas operations within the week, appeared perfect according to every electronic diagnostic system that Miller and his team of 8 engineering specialists had employed. The main gun functioned flawlessly, the engine ran smoothly, and the drivetrain showed no mechanical stress or component fatigue that would explain the catastrophic malfunction that had grounded this critical asset. But the turret rotation system produced a grinding, tearing sound that suggested imminent mechanical failure despite computer analysis showing all components within normal operational parameters. The hydraulic pressure readings were perfect. The electrical systems showed no faults, and the mechanical linkages appeared properly aligned according to laser measurement systems that could detect variances measured in thousandths of an inch. Lieutenant Miller, we've recalibrated the hydraulic pressure sensors for the 3rd time, reported Specialist Rodriguez, a young mechanic whose technical training emphasized computer diagnostics over hands-on mechanical experience. All readings remain within specifications, but that grinding noise is definitely getting worse each time we test the rotation. Miller slammed his fist against the diagnostic console with frustration that had been building through 3 sleepless nights of troubleshooting that had produced no results, despite following every procedure in the technical manuals. There has to be something we're missing. Machines don't malfunction without cause, and our diagnostic equipment is specifically designed to identify any component that's operating outside normal parameters. Sergeant First Class David Evans, the senior NCO assigned to Miller's maintenance team, had been observing the troubleshooting efforts with growing concern that stemmed not from technical inadequacy, but from a sense that the young lieutenant's approach was missing something fundamental that computer analysis couldn't capture. Evans was 42 years old, with 20 years of military service that included multiple deployments and extensive field maintenance experience under combat conditions, where diagnostic computers were luxuries rather than necessities. His hands bore the scars of working on damaged equipment under fire, and his instincts had been developed through years of learning to read mechanical systems through sound, vibration, and the subtle signs that experienced mechanics recognized but struggled to articulate to those who relied primarily on electronic analysis. "Sir," Evans ventured carefully, understanding that his suggestion might be interpreted as questioning his lieutenant's technical competence. "Maybe we should try some hands-on diagnostic work instead of relying entirely on the computers. Sometimes mechanical problems create symptoms that sensors can't quite capture." Miller turned toward Evans with barely concealed irritation at what he perceived as outdated methodology being suggested as superior to systematic electronic analysis. "Sergeant Evans, we're working with some of the most sophisticated diagnostic equipment in the world. If there was a mechanical problem that hands-on inspection could identify, these sensors would have detected it already. We need to trust our instruments and follow proper analytical procedures." The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of a figure who seemed completely out of place in the high-tech maintenance environment. An elderly man in his late 70s walked through the hangar entrance, carrying a worn canvas tool bag that appeared to predate most of the equipment in the facility. He wore a faded flannel shirt over work pants, and his weathered face suggested decades of outdoor labor under conditions far removed from the climate-controlled precision of modern military maintenance facilities. Gerald Walsh moved with the careful deliberation of someone whose joints had been worn by decades of physical work, but his clear blue eyes scanned the hangar with the kind of focused attention that suggested he was processing information at a rate that belied his elderly appearance. When he spotted the silent tank surrounded by frustrated engineers, his expression shifted to something that looked like recognition, mixed with professional interest. "Excuse me?" Miller called out, with obvious irritation at this unauthorized intrusion into his workspace. "This is a restricted maintenance facility. Civilian visitors need to check in at the main administration building and arrange for proper escort before entering operational areas." Gerald approached without responding to Miller's challenge, his attention focused on the tank rather than the young officer who was questioning his presence. He set down his tool bag and began a slow visual inspection of the vehicle, occasionally nodding to himself as if confirming details that only he could perceive. Miller felt his frustration spike at what appeared to be deliberate ignoring of his authority. "Sir, I asked you a question. You need to identify yourself and explain your authorization for being in this facility, or I'll have to call security to escort you out." Gerald finally turned his attention toward Miller, and his calm expression showed neither defensiveness about his presence nor concern about the lieutenant's aggressive questioning. "General Thompson sent me to look at your tank problem. I'm Gerald Walsh." The claim to have been sent by the base commanding general struck Miller as unlikely given the visitor's appearance and complete lack of proper credentials or escort. "Sir, if General Thompson wanted to send a consultant, he would have gone through proper channels and provided advance notice to facility command. I'm going to need to see some identification and official authorization before I can allow you anywhere near this equipment." Gerald reached into his shirt pocket and withdrew a laminated card that he handed to Miller without comment. The lieutenant examined it with the expectation that he would find either expired credentials or some kind of civilian contractor ID that didn't actually authorize access to restricted maintenance facilities. What Miller saw made him laugh with barely concealed contempt. The identification card showed Gerald's photograph and name, along with military service dates that indicated his active duty had ended over 30 years earlier. The card itself appeared to be a retirement credential rather than current authorization for access to sensitive military equipment. "Mr. Walsh," Miller said, with exaggerated patience, "this card shows you retired from military service before I was born. Whatever experience you may have had decades ago doesn't give you current authorization to access our maintenance facilities or interfere with ongoing repair operations that require current technical certifications." Gerald took back his credential card and returned it to his pocket with the patient movements of someone who had encountered skeptical young officers many times before. "General Thompson specifically requested that I examine your turret rotation problem. If you'd like to confirm that with his office, I'm happy to wait while you make the call." Miller pulled out his cell phone and dialed the general's aide with the confidence of someone who believed he was about to expose either a confused elderly civilian or an elaborate con attempt. The aide answered on the second ring with professional courtesy that quickly shifted to something more significant when Miller mentioned Gerald Walsh's name. "Lieutenant Miller, Mr. Walsh is indeed authorized to access your facility and examine the tank that's been giving your team trouble. The general specifically requested his assistance based on his extensive experience with main battle tank maintenance. Please provide him with full cooperation and access to whatever equipment or information he requires." The aide's confirmation left Miller standing with his phone in hand, struggling to understand why a commanding general would bypass normal consultant protocols to send an elderly retiree rather than requesting depot-level technical support from specialists with current certifications and modern training. Gerald had been unpacking his tool bag during Miller's phone call, removing instruments that made several of the younger engineers exchange amused glances at what appeared to be antique equipment that belonged in a military museum rather than a modern maintenance facility. The tools were clearly handmade or heavily modified, worn wrenches with custom bends, measuring devices that predated digital electronics, and diagnostic instruments that seemed designed for specific applications rather than general use. "Mr. Walsh," Miller said, with barely concealed sarcasm now that he was forced to acknowledge the visitor's legitimate authorization, "I appreciate that General Thompson sent you, but I should inform you that we've been working on this tank for 3 days, using the most advanced diagnostic equipment available. We've replaced multiple components, recalibrated all systems, and followed every troubleshooting procedure in the technical manuals without identifying the source of the turret rotation problem." Gerald nodded with understanding while continuing to arrange his tools with the careful precision of someone who knew exactly where each instrument belonged. Sometimes the most advanced equipment misses things that simpler approaches can detect, Lieutenant. "Mind if I take a look?" Miller gestured toward the tank with theatrical courtesy that suggested he was humoring someone whose outdated methods were about to be exposed as completely inadequate for modern military maintenance challenges. "By all means, Mr. Walsh. Perhaps your vintage tools will reveal something that our million-dollar diagnostic systems somehow overlooked. Gerald approached the silent tank and did something that made Miller's jaw clench with frustrated disbelief. He placed his weathered hand flat against the armored hull and simply stood there, apparently listening to or feeling for something that the lieutenant couldn't begin to understand or respect as legitimate diagnostic methodology. Lieutenant Miller watched Gerald Walsh stand motionless with his hand against the tank's armored hull for what felt like an eternity of wasted time, and his patience with this elderly consultant's unorthodox approach finally reached its breaking point. The young officer had been awake for nearly 72 consecutive hours, troubleshooting this mechanical failure using every systematic protocol he had learned, and watching an old man engage in what appeared to be mystical communion with 70 tons of steel felt like an insult to proper engineering methodology. "Mr. Walsh," Miller announced, with voice rising to ensure that his 8-person maintenance team could hear his professional assessment of what they were witnessing. "I appreciate whatever folk wisdom you may have accumulated during your service, but we're dealing with an integrated weapons system that requires systematic electronic analysis, not whatever this is that you're doing." Gerald didn't respond immediately to Miller's challenge. Instead, he withdrew a metal rod from his tool bag, a simple steel shaft about 12 inches long, and began tapping it gently against various points on the tank's hull, while leaning his head close to listen to the resulting sounds, with the focused attention of a doctor conducting a physical examination. Several of the younger engineers couldn't suppress quiet laughter at the spectacle of this elderly man attempting to diagnose a sophisticated mechanical system through percussion analysis when their computer screens displayed gigabytes of diagnostic data that should have revealed any component malfunction detectable through such primitive methods. Specialist Rodriguez leaned toward his fellow engineer and whispered just loud enough for others to hear, "Is he seriously trying to troubleshoot a main battle tank by knocking on it with a stick? What's next? Reading tea leaves to predict hydraulic pressure?" The mocking comment drew additional laughter from the maintenance team, and Miller felt validated in his assessment that General Thompson had made an error in judgment by sending this relic from a pre-digital era to address a problem that clearly required modern engineering expertise. "Sergeant Evans," Miller ordered, with voice carrying command authority that made clear this decision was not open for discussion, "please escort Mr. Walsh out of the maintenance bay. I appreciate that he was sent here with good intentions, but his methods are not compatible with our troubleshooting protocols, and his presence is becoming disruptive to my team's work." Evans shifted uncomfortably, torn between following his lieutenant's order and his growing instinct that dismissing Gerald Walsh might be a catastrophic mistake. The sergeant's 2 decades of field experience had taught him to recognize when someone knew more than their appearance suggested, and everything about Walsh's focused examination of the tank indicated genuine expertise rather than elderly confusion. "Sir," Evans ventured carefully, "maybe we should let Mr. Walsh complete his examination before we decide whether his approach has value. General Thompson specifically requested his assistance, which suggests—" "Sergeant Evans," Miller interrupted sharply, "I don't recall asking for your tactical assessment of this situation. I gave you a direct order to escort this civilian out of our maintenance facility. Are you refusing to follow that order?" The public confrontation left Evans with no choice but compliance, and he approached Gerald with obvious reluctance about what he was being ordered to do. "Mr. Walsh, I'm sorry, but the lieutenant has asked me to escort you out of the maintenance bay." Gerald looked up from his examination of the tank and studied both Evans and Miller with an expression that suggested he understood far more about the dynamics of military hierarchy and young officer arrogance than either of them realized. He reached into his tool bag and withdrew an instrument that immediately captured Evans's attention because of its unusual appearance and obvious history. The tool was a wrench that had clearly been handmade or extensively modified from salvaged materials. The metal shaft showed signs of having been cut, bent, and welded to create a specific angle and leverage point that standard tools couldn't replicate. The handle bore scorch marks and the kind of wear that came from extensive use under harsh conditions, and the entire instrument carried the unmistakable character of something that had been forged out of desperate necessity rather than manufactured to specifications. As Gerald's weathered hands gripped that custom-made wrench, his mind was suddenly transported backward through 33 years to a desert landscape where that same tool had been created under conditions that made the current maintenance facility's climate-controlled precision seem like absurd luxury. In his memory, Gerald was 44 years old, commander of a tank named Bad Penny during Operation Desert Storm. His crew was pinned down under enemy fire. Their turret rotation system had suffered damage from a near-miss artillery round, and conventional tools couldn't reach the damaged hydraulic coupling that was preventing them from returning effective fire against targets that were methodically destroying American positions. Gerald had taken metal fragments from damaged equipment, used a cutting torch powered by their tank's auxiliary generator, and spent 2 hours under sporadic fire creating the bent wrench that could reach into the narrow space where standard tools couldn't fit. That improvised instrument had saved his crew's lives by restoring their ability to engage enemy armor, and he had carried it ever since, as a reminder that sometimes survival required innovation that no technical manual could provide. "Mr. Walsh?" Evans's voice pulled Gerald back to the present, where he found the sergeant looking at the custom wrench with obvious interest, despite his orders to remove its owner from the facility. "This tool," Gerald said quietly, his voice carrying undertones of memory and significance that made Evans pay closer attention, despite his lieutenant's impatience, "was made under fire in 1991 when my crew needed to repair our tank's turret system without proper equipment. It's designed to reach coupling points that standard wrenches can't access, and it saved more than one tank crew when conventional approaches failed." Miller had been watching this exchange with growing frustration that the elderly consultant was attempting to delay his removal with sentimental stories about improvised tools from conflicts that predated modern maintenance methodology by decades. "Mr. Walsh, I'm sure your war stories are fascinating to veterans who remember when tanks were maintained with hammers and intuition, but we're working with integrated electronic systems that require proper diagnostic equipment and certified repair procedures. Your handmade tools and field improvisation techniques are simply not relevant to current maintenance standards. Gerald looked directly at Miller with an expression that seemed to evaluate the young officer's character and find it significantly lacking, despite his impressive credentials and modern training. "Lieutenant, I can hear what's wrong with your tank just by listening to it. That grinding noise you've been trying to diagnose for 3 days is coming from a hydraulic valve that's slightly out of alignment. Not enough to register on your pressure sensors, but enough to create mechanical stress that's going to cause catastrophic failure if you deploy this vehicle without correction." The specific diagnosis delivered with such quiet confidence made Evans take an involuntary step closer to Gerald, his instincts telling him that this assessment deserved serious consideration regardless of his lieutenant's skepticism about methods that predated digital analysis. But Miller had committed himself to his position that the elderly consultant's presence was interfering with proper troubleshooting procedures, and he wasn't about to be contradicted by someone whose diagnostic methodology consisted of touching metal and listening to sounds that sophisticated electronic sensors should detect far more accurately than human hearing. "Sergeant Evans, call military police and have them escort Mr. Walsh off this base immediately," Miller ordered, with finality that suggested his patience was completely exhausted. His unauthorized interference with our maintenance operations has gone beyond mere nuisance to active disruption of critical repair work. Evans pulled out his radio with extreme reluctance, but before he could make the call, Gerald spoke one more time, with voice that carried steel beneath its calm exterior. "Lieutenant Miller, you're about to make a mistake that will define your career in ways you can't yet understand. But if you're determined to remove me before I can show you what 3 days of computer analysis has failed to reveal, I won't fight your authority. Just remember this moment when this tank fails catastrophically during deployment because you trusted screens more than experience." As Evans reluctantly began calling for military police response, neither he nor Miller noticed that Master Sergeant Evans had quietly stepped away from the group and was making a phone call of his own to General Thompson's office, a call that would transform this maintenance facility confrontation into something with far more significant consequences than anyone currently present could imagine. Master Sergeant Evans stepped into a quiet corner of the hangar where his urgent phone call wouldn't be overheard by Lieutenant Miller or the other engineers who continued their fruitless diagnostic efforts. Evans's 20 years of service had taught him to recognize situations where proper chain of command needed to be bypassed to prevent catastrophic mistakes by officers whose rank exceeded their wisdom. General Thompson's office, Captain Martinez speaking. "Sir, this is Master Sergeant Evans from Hangar 12. I need to speak with the General immediately regarding Mr. Gerald Walsh, who was sent here to examine our disabled tank." The mention of Walsh's name had immediate effect on Captain Martinez's tone. "What's the current situation with Mr. Walsh, Sergeant?" "Sir, Lieutenant Miller has called military police to have him removed from the maintenance facility. The lieutenant considers Mr. Walsh's diagnostic methods to be disruptive and not compatible with our standard troubleshooting protocols." Evans heard what sounded like Captain Martinez dropping something on his desk, followed by rapid typing on a computer keyboard. Sergeant Evans, you are to ensure that Mr. Walsh remains in that hangar and is not removed under any circumstances. I'm notifying the General immediately, and he'll be responding personally to address this situation." The call ended, leaving Evans holding his radio while watching military police vehicles approaching the hangar entrance in response to Miller's summons for assistance, removing an uncooperative civilian consultant. Meanwhile, Lieutenant Miller had positioned himself between Gerald and the tank, his body language making clear that the elderly consultant's examination was finished regardless of whatever insights he claimed to possess about the mysterious mechanical failure. "Mr. Walsh, I've been patient with your unorthodox approach, despite my professional judgment that your methods have no place in modern military maintenance operations. But when you start making predictions about catastrophic failures based on nothing more than touching metal and listening to sounds that our sophisticated sensors haven't detected, you cross the line from misguided enthusiasm into irresponsible speculation that could undermine my team's confidence in proper diagnostic procedures." Gerald had been carefully packing his tools back into his canvas bag, his movements showing neither anger nor frustration at Miller's treatment, but rather a kind of resigned sadness that suggested he had encountered similar dismissal before, and understood that some lessons could only be learned through painful experience. "Lieutenant, I'm not trying to undermine your authority or your team's work. I'm trying to share knowledge that comes from decades of hands-on experience with these systems, under conditions where electronic diagnostics weren't available, and mechanical intuition was the difference between survival and catastrophic failure." Miller's response was interrupted by the arrival of two military police officers who entered the hangar and approached with the professional bearing of personnel, responding to a request for assistance from a commissioned officer. "Lieutenant Miller, you called for support with removing an unauthorized civilian from this facility?" the senior MP asked while observing Gerald with careful assessment that suggested he was evaluating potential threat levels. "That's correct," Miller confirmed. "This gentleman was sent here by General Thompson, but his methods are not compatible with our maintenance protocols, and his continued presence is disruptive to critical repair operations. I need him escorted off this installation." The MP sergeant turned toward Gerald and was about to request that he accompany them voluntarily when the sound of multiple vehicles approaching at high speed drew everyone's attention toward the hangar entrance. Through the open doors, personnel could see a convoy of command vehicles led by what was clearly the general's official car, all moving with enough urgency to suggest genuine emergency response rather than routine base traffic. General Marcus Thompson emerged from his vehicle before it had completely stopped, his expression showing barely controlled fury that made every person in the hangar immediately understand that someone had made a serious mistake. Behind him came his aide, the command sergeant major, and several other senior officers whose presence suggested this had escalated far beyond simple maintenance facility protocol enforcement. Thompson strode directly toward Gerald Walsh, while completely ignoring Lieutenant Miller, the military police, and everyone else present. When he reached the elderly consultant, the general came to perfect attention and rendered the most formal military salute that any of the watching personnel had ever witnessed from someone of Thompson's rank. "Mr. Walsh," Thompson said formally, his voice carrying clearly across the now silent hangar, "I apologize profoundly for the treatment you've received at this facility. Please accept my assurance that this situation will be addressed immediately and comprehensively." Gerald returned the salute with movements that seemed to shed decades from his frame, revealing glimpses of the master gunner he had been during his years of active service. The exchange between the four-star general and the elderly civilian in worn work clothes created a moment of profound confusion among everyone present, who had been working under the assumption that Gerald was an unauthorized interloper rather than someone deserving of such extraordinary respect. Thompson turned toward Lieutenant Miller with expression that made the young officer's confident demeanor evaporate instantly. "Lieutenant Miller, would you care to explain why I just received a report that you called military police to remove the most qualified tank maintenance specialist in the entire United States Army from the one facility where his expertise was specifically requested?" Miller's face had gone completely pale as he struggled to formulate a response that could somehow explain his actions without admitting that he had dismissed Gerald's capabilities based entirely on age and appearance rather than actual assessment of his knowledge and experience. General Thompson's fury was palpable as he addressed the assembled personnel. "Everyone needs to understand who Master Gunner Gerald Walsh is and why his presence represents an extraordinary privilege rather than an inconvenience to be dismissed." Thompson gestured toward Gerald. "Master Gunner Walsh literally wrote the original field maintenance protocols for Abrams tanks. During Desert Storm, he commanded a tank crew achieving 17 confirmed enemy vehicle kills while operating under conditions that would have disabled less capable crews. His tactical innovations became standard doctrine throughout armored divisions." The general's voice intensified. "Walsh was assigned to develop current Abrams maintenance procedures. That technical manual you consulted, Lieutenant Miller, the one you trusted more than the man standing before you, was written based on field experience Walsh accumulated keeping tanks operational under combat conditions where failure meant death." Thompson continued. "Walsh's nickname was the Ghost in the Machine because he could diagnose mechanical problems electronic systems couldn't detect. He could hear bearing wear pressure sensors missed, feel vibrations accelerometers couldn't quantify, and identify component stress metallurgical analysis wouldn't reveal until catastrophic failure." The general turned toward Miller with cold fury. Today, this legend was mocked by engineers who laughed at handmade tools, dismissed by a lieutenant who trusted computers more than decades of experience, and nearly removed by military police because you decided his methods weren't compatible with your protocols. "Lieutenant Miller, you are relieved pending investigation. Master Sergeant Evans will assume facility supervision." Thompson addressed Gerald. "Mr. Walsh, would you show these engineers what 3 days of computer analysis failed to accomplish?" Gerald approached the tank with his custom wrench, reaching into the turret mechanism access panel. Within 5 minutes of careful adjustment in a location standard tools couldn't reach, he made a single precise correction to hydraulic valve alignment. "Try the rotation now," Gerald instructed. The turret moved with perfect smoothness. No grinding, just normal operational noise. The engineers stood stunned as they realized an 80-year-old man with handmade tools had solved in minutes what sophisticated equipment couldn't detect in 3 days. The hangar erupted in spontaneous applause, but Gerald simply packed his tools and prepared to leave, his mission complete, without need for triumph or vindication. 6 weeks later, Lieutenant Miller sat in a veterans club workshop watching Gerald Walsh restore a vintage truck engine. Miller no longer wore his uniform, reassigned to administrative duties away from equipment maintenance, but had requested this meeting to offer an overdue apology. "Mr. Walsh, I know I have no right to your time, but I wanted to apologize personally. My behavior was arrogant, disrespectful, and demonstrated complete failure to recognize expertise that didn't match my narrow expectations." Gerald looked up and gestured to an empty stool. "Sit down, son. Tell me what you've learned." Miller sat carefully. "I've learned that all my education gave me technical competence, but not wisdom. I measured people by age and tools rather than understanding and experience. I trusted instruments more than instincts because I didn't understand some knowledge can't be displayed on screens." Gerald continued working. "Technology is valuable, Lieutenant. Those diagnostic computers are remarkable tools, but they're just tools. They don't replace human understanding of how machines work when you listen to what they're telling you. How did you know what was wrong when our sensors showed normal readings? Experience. I've heard that grinding sound dozens of times over 4 decades. I knew it meant hydraulic valve misalignment, even though pressure sensors couldn't detect the problem because it was too subtle. The sound told me what instruments couldn't see." Miller watched Gerald's hands work with practiced precision. "Would you teach me? Not technical details from manuals, but things you learn from actually listening to machines?" Gerald smiled warmly. "That's what this is, son. This carburetor is telling me its history through wear patterns and component stress. If you listen carefully to details instruments can't measure, every machine will teach you its secrets." As Miller began his education in wisdom beyond computers, General Thompson implemented the Master Gunner Mentorship Program, pairing young engineers with retired veterans who carried knowledge existing only in their experience and willingness to share with those humble enough to listen. The program's motto, suggested by Gerald: "Listen to the machine, learn from experience, respect those who came before." In Hangar 12, a plaque was mounted near the tank maintenance station. Sometimes the most sophisticated solution is recognizing that wisdom earned through decades of experience cannot be replaced by technology, no matter how advanced.